Welcome to the inaugural episode of Broken Dog Party, your weekly podcast for everything in your horror facet. I'm Sean Abernathy, and with me is...
I'm Murphy. That one.
I'm looking at the back of your head with such disdain right now.
We did no planning. So, well, you know what? We planned the segments a little bit, but I didn't think it would be so hard to say my name. I'm Christian Murphy. Murphy, thank you.
I'm Lolly at Journey, but I sometimes go by Monkey.
So, either we just listened to or are about to listen to a story featuring fantastic work from guest voice Derrick Álvarez, who I'll say it now in case I forget later. You can find on Instagram at Derrick Alhe, Derekalhe. Even though he and Ouija's travels in recent decades had taken the man known as Horace Lynchwood all over the world and places beyond, the old man still couldn't help but consider this place home. It had been almost 5 years since they had last stopped by, but as Ouija blew past him into the dirty grease stain of a bar, Horace stared up at the sign and grinned that somber smile of one who has outlived many. Too many. Yet despite the gray in his hair, his mind was as sharp as it had ever been, and he let his memories take him back to the first time he ever laid eyes on this little corner of the world. Its entrance tucked away in the most unsightly alley on the type of street you couldn't find without knowing where to look in the first place. Horace scoffed to himself when he realized that nearly 50 years had passed. A much younger Horace squints at the sign through the rain. The Arkham Corner. He was almost certain that this was the place he had been looking for. Maybe it was because he himself wasn't much of a fan of Lovecraftian fiction, but he thought for a place where those who have beat back the dark to gather, it seemed like one hell of a kitschy name. He walked in all the same, patting the spot on his jacket under which his firearm rested just to assure himself he wasn't entirely alone. There was always steel to separate him from his fear. Upon entering the bar, Horace found himself scratching at the stubble on his face as he looked up at another sign, this one above an open doorway separating something of a coat room from the bar proper, reading, "Only verified seers are exempt from weapons check." Through the doorway he could see some rough types and hear murmurs, as well as the squawk of what seemed to be a sizable bird. Horace left his jacket on. He didn't want to be disarmed. He shook his attention from the sign and walked through the doorway, where he was immediately stopped by a massive, tanned hand on his chest coming from the dark to his left. Horace followed the hand past a dark metal bracelet and a thick, hairy arm until just past the broad shoulder it came from was a large and genuine smile from a behemoth of a Spaniard sitting down just on the other side of the doorway. Horace couldn't help but jump a bit, but he was disarmed by the man's bright demeanor in such a shadowy corner long before the stranger spoke.
"Welcome to the Arkham Corner. We ask that all new faces leave their weapons with me."
He took his hand off of Horace's chest and patted the top of a display case to his left. There were a few knives, guns, and sticks, all displayed prominently above labels proclaiming the owner. There, in the middle of these violent curiosities, was one empty spot, one that even seemed to be indented in the shape of the AMT hardballer he had holstered under his arm. sight of the indentation held his attention so absolutely that he didn't notice he had drawn his pistol until he was already absent-mindedly handing it over to the gentleman in front of him. He took Horace's gun and then politely continued in his jovial tone.
Hey, Greenhorn, you have never been to a place like this, have you? You can call me Tito.
The more Horace looked around, the more a sense of wonder started to set in. The beasts that were mounted to the walls were unlike anything he could have imagined outside of fiction, and even if it was all Hollywood hoax work, well, it was damn good. Yeah, pleased to meet you, Tito. Horace reached out to shake Tito's hand without looking away from the decor surrounding them. Tito grabbed Horace's hand and pulled his attention back.
Careful, Greenhorn. You don't want to use your true name in a place like this. Not around the line of work some of the patrons are in. It's not about who you are now, but who you want to become.
Horace broke eye contact with Tito when he realized the man wasn't holding his gun. He looked at the display case and saw the pistol nestled there comfortably as if it had been sitting there for years.
So, how shall we know you here?
Horace Lynchwood. He answered confidently. It wasn't the name he was born with. No one had referred to him by this name before, and it had never left his lips before that moment. Yet it felt right. As he said it, Horace had once again met Tito's gaze, but he looked now back over to the display, and there, under his hardballer, was a name tag reading Horace Lynchwood. When the fuck did you write? Horace tried to ask, but was cut short.
Well, young Lynchwood, if this is to be your first foray into this world, then let me impart upon you a valuable lesson in the power held by names.
Tito reached into a personal cooler on his right side, propped up against the doorway. He pulled out 2 bottles of some unlabeled ale and popped their tops before passing one to Horace, clinking them together and taking a generous swig from his own. Horace took it in good faith and drank from the bottle he was passed. Tito watched Horace intently. As the brewmaster here, he was ever eager to see how someone took to one of his concoctions. Horace could feel his head swimming in a strange new manner almost immediately, but the dark, herbal taste consumed his senses, and he drank far more of the unknown liquor than he should have in good conscience. He blinked a few times and found that each time he did, the room seemed to get a couple shades lighter, until it was as if he had a feline's night vision. Without asking what had happened, the dim lighting in the bar suddenly made a strange sort of sense, although this parlor trick seemed a feat beyond his knowledge of medical science, however far from vast that was. Tito began his story.
I can see your skepticism, asking yourself something like, how likely is it that creatures exist lurking in our dark places? Think of it this way. Throughout the course of human history, everything that happened had to happen. Just the way it did, in order for things to line up. For your parents to meet and you to exist, for better or worse. Now, I'm far from a statistician. Hell, I failed math at least once. But still. That's you, amigo. You are 1 in a million. It's for that reason I have to apologize that you also happen to be unfortunate enough to come across this little slice of life. I would urge you to turn around now, as this is not something you can unlearn, but I have seen the look in your eye many times before on the faces of many other greenhorns, and even though I cannot know what brought you here and why, I know there is nothing short of a shotgun blast that would make you consider turning around now. Just know that the truth won't protect you from them.
Tito tilted his head subtly towards the crowd at the bar, expressing a certain distrust within his own community, then continued.
But a little bit of knowledge can go a long way with some things that lurk in the dark. Just not all things. Rarely demons. And never ifrits.
Horace scrunched up his face a bit. He was listening, but was completely unsure of where the mountainous man was going with this story. Tito kept going after taking a swig from his drink.
No one can hope to know everything about every one of our that witch bumps in the night creatures. In reality, very few can accurately separate fact from fiction on a regular basis. This makes the group of hunters that run through here sound far more like old fishermen telling exaggerated tales than the last bastion between you and the boogeyman. Anyone in this business long enough can tell you though, if you don't have a good spiritualist on speed dial, then eventually you are gonna find yourself cornered by something your armaments cannot harm. Now, I'm gonna call back to those odds again, good buddy. Despite the complexities involved in human birth, you are still 1 in a million. However, horror can arise from something as mundane as lighting a candle. Even at 1 in a trillion, a fire starts in a far simpler manner than human life, and may be among very few things that spread faster. So, should that candle in the window pull something from perdition, then know that there is extraordinarily little anyone can do to save you. It is the flame that tethers them, but only someone who knows their true name can extinguish their flame and banish an ifrit. While a demon may not necessarily be evil, an ifrit seeks only distraction.
Tito took a moment to pull out a cigarette and light it. He offered Horace one, and with a hand motion it was declined, as Tito continued on.
Now I will admit that I don't know where this story comes from, but it's an old one in the community and the reason for the fear behind the eyes of many gathered here tonight.
The large man took a long drag from his smoke and seemed to settle in for the long run, with respects to the story he felt he had to tell.
As the sun made its way below the horizon, the farmhouse was sheathed in a dark, moonless shade, permeated only by the weak glow from the one light bulb in the entire house, at its very center, hanging from the living room ceiling. The family was just starting to separate for the night, preparing for bed. However, older brother stayed seated with his book and his parents in the living room. Nero was tasked that night, as he was every night, with helping his little sister get ready for bed. The routine never took any time at all and he didn't mind. His little sister was the only one who seemed to appreciate him anyway, and every night always ended the same. This end's beginning was no different as they left the rest of the family in the living room. Nero stuck a match and lit the candle in his hands before they rounded the corner, and already sister was getting excited and asking if he was going to play her a song tonight. He liked that she asked, because he wasn't particularly good and it was nice to have someone, however small, to give him a reason to keep practicing. He set the candle into its holder in his sister's open bedroom window, the wind causing it to flicker and cast a shadow, like a sinister grin on the opposite wall, as Nero picked up his fiddle. Just like that, the night was different. There was a heat in young Nero's hands like he had never felt before. as his fingers danced across the neck of the fiddle, and he worked the bow with a ferocity and understanding that he had never possessed it before. When he looked over to his little sister to see if she looked drowsy enough for him to try and slow down and lull her to sleep, he was alarmed to see that she was staring at him with a speechless terror plastered all over her face. Then he noticed that he couldn't speak, nor could he stop playing. He could only look on through his own eyes at his horrified little sister as he felt something curl his lips into a grin. The shadow that Nero cast on the far wall was broad and looming, despite the small child's lithe frame. To say that the musical ferocity would look more at home from a creature the size of his shadow as opposed to the little boy himself would make a lot of sense. What didn't make sense, though, was that the shadow was growing, becoming more harshly angled, and not playing the fiddle at all. Rather, as the darkness behind Nero grew, so too did it become thicker, until it was something more than just a darkness on the wall, and the Ifrit abruptly stood behind young Nero. It dropped its impossible long fingers around his shoulder, and the warmth that he had felt in his hands seemed to spread down his arms and up into his throat. The fiddle played out, but a lower volume as Sister watched the Ifrit open its mouth and call out in Nero's pubescent voice. "Brother, come quick! I have gotten so much better! Sister started to shout, but the wind from the window pulled the flame of the candle outside for a minute, and though the flame was able to hold on, the room lost all visibility. An unnatural dark, punctuated only by a sudden heavy crack, and the frantic music coming from the instrument within. Sister now silent. Had it been quieter, that night you might have even been able to hear the wind whistling across their small farm, yet nothing could be done about the little flame in the bedroom window. As that flame began to settle back onto its candle, it illuminated the room once more to reveal Nero still playing his fiddle, but now looking on toward Sister's bed, where she lay face down and body up. The Ifrit allowed Nero to cry, but only stretched the child's grin farther. The tears steamed off his overheated face as the inhuman grin on his visage began to crack his lips. Just before the bedroom door opened, he could hear his older brother's footsteps. He tried to scream, to tell him to run away, to grab Mom and Dad and never turn back, but nothing. Instead, as the door opened over Nero's right shoulder, his own neck was immediately and violently turned to face his brother in the doorway. "I'm so glad you could join us." It was still Nero's voice that spoke, even if his mouth never moved, yet now the voice sounded wrong. Rattling, inhuman, and excited. The child stared at brother with eyes that now leaked blood from their corners, only to drip past torn lips and stain a youthful smile crimson. The door to the bedroom then slammed into brother from behind, forcing him into the room and briefly pushing the flame back out of the window, sending the room once again into a fiddle-fueled and inexplicable darkness. In the deep black, the sound accompanying the fiddle now could perhaps only be described as a sort of wet percussion. The wind had died down. Its quiet whistling briefly replaced by solemn spluttering and stretched strings that seemed to never end. Then, A thought before Nero's now smoking form played the flame back onto its roost. The dim light revealed a bloody scene. Brother's body now cantered in a corner, holes in his chest large enough to see the wall behind him. Mom or Dad could now be heard making their way towards the bedroom, presumably to put their foot down about all the noise at bedtime. The Ifrit curled his tail around the child, who served as such a fine musical backdrop for his evening topside. Then he flicked his tail across Nero's feet, and the child ignited. The fiddle never stopping as the fire spread up, Nero and across the bedroom at the same impossible speed. Only now, in the Inferno, as the instrument itself snaps through burning strings and the music comes to a halt, can the Ifrit truly be seen as something more than just a shadowy figure? The Ifrit floats with terrifying grace to the open window, braced by the Inferno behind him. He picks up his own candle and grins with an impossible number of teeth before blowing out his own candle. Flames in the room are so hot now that the candle is nearly melted before it, can hit the floor, and the Ifrit had returned to perdition before even that. For to them the earth is no different, and we are all but kindling for the flame that must be.